Welcome to Black Belt Radio show number 19. I'm Kevin Case. Today, we're taking a closer look at the history of Wanshu, a form that carries a lot more depth than many people realize. It's one of those forms that's traveled through multiple martial traditions, and the deeper you look, the more you start to see how layered that history really is. What makes Wanshu especially interesting is that it sits at the intersection of tradition, transmission, and historical uncertainty. There's parts of its story that are fairly well supported, and there are other parts that have been passed down more through tradition than through hard documentation. That doesn't make the form any less valuable. In many ways, it makes it more worth studying. For those of us who care about martial arts as more than technique, this kind of history matters. It helps us understand not just what we practice, but how these forms were preserved, adapted, and handed down from one generation to the next. So in this episode, we're going to spend some time with Wanshu, where it likely came from, how it moved through Okinawan, Japanese, and Korean martial traditions, and why it still deserves serious attention today. And if you'd like to read the full white paper behind this episode, you can find it on our website. Let's get into it.
Welcome to this segment of Black Belt Radio. You know, usually when we talk about history, especially martial arts history, there is this expectation of a straight line.
Right, like a pristine family tree or something.
Exactly. Like the common belief is that one ancient master creates a sequence of movements, hands it down to a student, and it just gets passed along.
Perfectly preserved in amber.
Yeah, perfectly preserved, straight to you on the mat today. But, well, then you start looking at the actual documented historical record.
And suddenly that neat little family tree looks more like a wildly overgrown garden.
It really does. We are looking at a historical landscape that is incredibly murky. And actually, that is our mission for you today. We are exploring the cultural journey of a very specific martial arts form.
Right. The form known as Wanshu or Yunbi.
Yes, which is practiced in Tang Soo Do. The goal here is to look at why knowing the actual documented history of this form doesn't take away from its mystique. In fact, it transforms how you appreciate your training the second you step onto the mat in the dojang.
Oh, absolutely. Moving away from folklore and stepping into verifiable history, it causes a profound shift in perspective.
It really does. And to do this, we are drawing on a highly specific stack of sources today.
We are. We have a compelling white paper by Grandmaster Kevin Case, which, meticulously lays out the distinction between tradition and historical evidence.
It's a great read. We are also examining exhibition records from the Tokyo National Museum, the Japan Karate Association's official technical manuals, and some really rigorous historical research from the Sasakawa Peace Foundation.
And considering the breadth of those documents, we are dealing with Chinese envoys, Okinawan traders,
Japanese systematization, and Korean preservation. It's a lot.
It is a lot. To ground all of this, think about the emblem of the United Tang Soo Do Association.
Oh, right, the patch.
Yeah, that emblem is actually the perfect visual metaphor for what we are analyzing today. It features a bold, fierce tiger's head surrounded by a ring of stars, a laurel wreath at the bottom, and a central martial character.
It's a really striking design.
It is. It takes all these disparate symbols representing different virtues and histories and unifies them into one cohesive, powerful image.
Which is exactly what the art is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Tang Soo Do functions the exact same way. It is a proud, unified system, but it is built on undeniably diverse international roots.
A unified system built from different moving parts. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Because before we can even talk about the physical movements you're doing in the form, we have to address the legend of the name itself.
The Wang Ji myth.
Right. If you spend any time in a dojang, you are going to hear the prevailing myth. The story that an ancient Chinese master named Wang Ji personally invented this exact sequence of punches and kicks.
Right, and that it was handed down completely intact over centuries.
Yeah. My problem with that is it sounds like a massive game of historical telephone. So how much of this origin story is actually backed by proof?
Well, the short answer is that the man is absolutely real.
Okay.
But the claim of his direct authorship over the physical movements is where the historical telephone distorts the truth.
Got it. So who was he?
According to the research from the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, Wang Ji was a documented historical figure. He was a Qing dynasty envoy.
And we know when he lived.
We know exactly when he traveled. He was the second Qing envoy sent to the Ryukyu Kingdom, which is modern-day Okinawa, visiting in June of 1683.
Wow, 1683. I want to pause on that term, envoy, because it is easy to hear that and just think diplomat, like a guy in a suit.
Right, like an ambassador today.
Yeah, but an envoy in the 17th century wasn't just sitting at a desk stamping passports. These were elite cultural ambassadors.
Absolutely.
They were highly educated, often bringing poetry, philosophy, trade negotiations, and yes, sometimes martial knowledge to the regions they visited.
That cultural prestige is a crucial context, and we actually have the physical artifacts to back up his presence.
We do.
Yeah. The Tokyo National Museum has an exhibition list of Ryukyu heritage that includes a surviving poem attributed to Wang Ji, and it's dated to around that exact same time, 1683. So we have diplomatic records and his poetry. The man existed, and he was in the right place at the exact right time to influence the martial culture of Okinawa.
Okay, but I am looking at the white paper by the author we mentioned earlier, and he makes a really important distinction here.
He does.
Writing a poem in 1683 and authoring a complex 40-plus movement combat form that perfectly matches what a student does in the dojang today. Those are two vastly different things.
They are entirely different things. The author of the white paper emphasizes that while his connection to the region is undeniable, there is zero historical proof that Wang Ji personally authored the physical kata in the exact sequence practiced today.
So the name is more of a tribute.
Exactly. The tradition that the form is named after him might preserve a real cultural memory of his influence or maybe his teachings. But if we say he definitely personally created this specific sequence, we stop doing history and start repeating folklore.
Right.
The evidence just does not support a direct, immaculate conception of the form.
So if it didn't just pop into existence fully formed, it's more like a recipe that different chefs tweaked over time.
That is exactly what it is. The historical evidence overwhelmingly points to the island of Okinawa as the true crucible where the physical mechanics were developed and refined.
Okinawa makes perfect sense geographically. I mean, it was essentially the crossroads of the Pacific. It was a major hub of trade and cultural exchange between China, Japan, and Southeast Asia.
It was a total melting pot. According to a source we reviewed called Budo no Kukyo, the form we now call Wanshu circulated heavily within Okinawan martial traditions.
Specifically Tamarite, right?
Yes, exactly. It was associated with an area and a style known as Tamarite.
Let's define Tamarite for the listener, because it wasn't some highly formalized, pristine military training academy.
Not at all.
Tamari was a bustling port town. The martial arts developing there were heavily influenced by the sailors, merchants, and guards passing through the docks.
It was gritty, adaptable fighting.
Which explains why the form couldn't be a rigid, untouchable artifact. It had to work in real life.
It had to be adaptable to survive.
Yeah.
And we see that adaptability in this historical record. By the time this form enters the modern written literature, it wasn't a single rigid sequence at all.
It had already splintered.
It had already branched out, yes. The text commonly discussed two distinct variant lines of transmission that developed in Okinawa.
Matsumura Wanshu and Itosu Wanshu.
Exactly.
So two different Okinawan masters, Matsumura and Itosu, took the base material and put their own spin on it. You know, I like to think of this like open source software.
Ooh, that's a great analogy.
Yeah, you have the original code, but then different developers fork it. They patch it and alter it to run on different hardware, in this case, different body types or combat philosophies.
That is a fantastic way to visualize it. Matsumura might have emphasized certain linear power dynamics, while Itosu might have modified the chambering or the stances to fit his specific curriculum.
Right.
This branching proves something fundamental about the form. It has always been a living, breathing practice. It adapted across generations in Okinawa long before it ever left the island.
And I want to tie this directly to the person listening right now. If you have ever gone to a tournament and watched another school perform this exact form, but you noticed their stances were slightly wider, or their timing on a specific block was different than how your instructor taught you.
You might think they're doing it wrong.
Right, but you are not necessarily watching someone do it wrong. You are literally watching that historical split between masters like Matsumura and Itosu play out in real time today.
You are seeing the open source software running different versions.
Exactly.
It grounds the history in the physical reality of the modern mat. But, the journey of this form is far from over.
Right, it doesn't stop in Okinawa.
For this Okinawan development to eventually reach Korea and become a core part of Tang Soo Do, it first had to cross the sea to mainland Japan. And that required a massive cultural translation.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This transition is fascinating because it wasn't just a natural migration, it was forced by the geopolitical climate.
Yes.
The 1920s is a pivotal decade. Our sources note that martial arts were being systematized, but we have to look at why they moved from Okinawa to Japan in the first place.
Right. In the 1920s, Japan was highly nationalistic. Okinawa, which had been annexed, was often viewed by the mainland as somewhat provincial or backward.
Yeah.
For Okinawan martial arts to be accepted by the broader Japanese public, and specifically by the Japanese educational system, they couldn't just arrive as rough dogfighting techniques from a subjugated territory.
They needed to be cleaned up.
They need to be organized, categorized, and crucially, rebranded.
Enter Bichin Funakoshi. He was instrumental in bringing these arts to the mainland, and he realized that if this system was going to survive and gain legitimacy, he had to make it culturally palatable to the Japanese.
He did.
So he took Wanshu, our Okinawan form that still carried the name of a Chinese envoy, and gave it a new Japanese name in the Shotokan system.
He called it Empi, sometimes spelled Empi.
He stripped away the Chinese namesake entirely.
Completely. But he wasn't just translating the sound of the word into Japanese. He applied a completely new poetic imagery to the physical movements.
Okay, so what does MP mean?
NP translates to the flying swallow, or the flight of a swallow.
They took a combat sequence meant for self-defense and named it after a tiny bird.
Sounds weird, right?
At first glance, that seems almost counterintuitive. Like, why not a tiger or a dragon, something intimidating?
To understand why, you have to look at the official technical manual for the instructor published by the Japan Karate Association.
Okay.
They still list MP today, and they explicitly describe the movement quality of the form as being suggestive of a swallow's flight.
A swallow's flight.
Think about how a swallow moves. It doesn't soar in a straight line like an eagle. It darts. It drops suddenly.
It's erratic.
Yeah, it changes altitude rapidly, diving low to the ground and then instantly springing back up into the air.
Oh, wow. So it's not just a pretty poetic name. It is quite literally an instruction manual hidden in a metaphor.
Yes.
If you watch someone perform this form at a high level in the dojang, that rapid change in elevation is exactly what you see. You are dropping your center of gravity incredibly low, shifting your weight, and then exploding upward.
What's fascinating here is how the rebranding actually impacts the physical technique. Adding the imagery of the swallow changes how a martial artist visualizes and executes the biomechanics.
That makes total sense.
If an instructor tells you to just drop your weight and stand back up, your body performs that mechanically. It is a lifeless repetition.
Just going through the motions.
But if you are told to move like a swallow, diving and rising, your intent shifts, your timing changes. The rhythm of the form alters to match the metaphor. The Japanese translation added a new layer of psychological and physical interpretation to the original Okinawan movements.
The imagery dictates the biomechanics. That completely reframes how I look at those movements.
It's brilliant.
But let's follow the timeline, because the swallow eventually has to fly to Korea. We are talking about Tang Soo Do, after all. So, how does a Japanese iteration of an Okinawan adaptation of a Chinese legend become a staple in a Korean martial art?
To understand that, we have to look at the post-World War II transition. After the war, Korea was liberated from Japanese occupation, and modern Korean martial arts began to formalize.
Right. They're early Kwans.
Exactly. The foundational schools that eventually became systems like Tang Soo Do. They were founded by Korean practitioners who had a very specific practical background.
Because during the occupation, many of these early Korean founders had lived, worked, or studied in Japan or Okinawa.
Yes.
They had learned Japanese systems like Shotokan out of necessity or circumstance.
That is correct. So when they returned to Korea and began establishing their own schools in a newly liberated country, they were faced with a pragmatic choice.
They needed material to teach.
Right. They didn't invent a dozen new forms out of thin air to teach their students.
Yeah.
They imported the deeply developed curriculums they had already mastered forms that had already survived the journey from Okinawa to Japan.
I was looking at the terminology references from our sources, and I noticed something really striking. Tang Soo Do essentially acts as a historical vault, preserving this entire family of forms.
It does.
But the naming convention they use today reveals this beautiful, almost conflicted duality. Some schools use the name Wanshu, while others use the name Yunbi.
And the author of the white paper details this duality clearly. It reflects the complex history of the art itself.
Right, because when a school uses the name Wanshu, they're essentially bypassing the Japanese and Okinawan translations to honor the oldest recorded origin, the 1683 Chinese envoy.
They're intentionally keeping that original cultural memory alive.
But then you have other groups, like the Western Tang Soo Do Federation, that use Yunbi. Since Yunbi is the Korean translation for swallow, it seems like they kept the Japanese metaphor, but just localized the language.
Exactly.
Why would post-war Korean masters keep a Japanese concept, given the history there?
It comes back to the biomechanics we discussed earlier. The swallow metaphor is too valuable as a teaching tool to discard.
The diving and rising.
Yes. Even though Korea was reclaiming its cultural identity after the occupation, the masters understood that the imagery of the diving and rising bird perfectly encapsulated how the body needed to move to generate power.
That is so pragmatic.
They localized the term to yunbi, scripting the Japanese language, but they kept the mechanical wisdom of the metaphor.
So depending on which dojang you walk into today, you might be practicing Wanshu, carrying the ghost of a Qing dynasty envoy.
Or you might be practicing yundi, carrying the physical rhythm of a diving bird.
But physically, mechanically, you are performing the exact same family of movements forged by Okinawan dock fighters.
It is a profound layering of history. The physical form is the same family, but the naming history carries the fingerprints of different cultures, different centuries, and different political realities.
So what does this all mean for the person listening to us right now who is going to sweat through this form tonight in the dojang? Why does it matter that this isn't just a clean, straight line from one ancient master?
Because understanding this history doesn't weaken the form. It deepens the practice.
How so?
If you buy into the myth that one person created it perfectly, your only job is to be a robotic copy of an unprovable past.
Just chasing a ghost.
Exactly. But when you look at the verifiable history, the Chinese Diplomatic Association, the Okinawan open source development, the Japanese biomechanical renaming, and the Korean post-war preservation, you realize you're engaging with something much more resilient.
You are stepping into a massive living chain of human survival and adaptation.
Practicing the form isn't about repeating a single origin myth. It is a physical, living demonstration of how knowledge moves across cultures.
Right.
It proves that martial arts adapt, absorb poetry, survive political upheavals, and are passed from hand to hand across oceans. Every time a student performs it, they are not just mimicking the past, they are adding their own generation's iteration to that timeline.
The straight line is boring. The overgrown garden is where the actual life is happening.
Beautifully said.
And that leaves us with this final thought. When you step onto the mat tonight and execute the movements of Wanshu, whose muscle memory are you actually performing? Are you expressing the intent of a 17th century Chinese envoy?
Are you channeling the gritty open source combat adaptations of an Okinawan master?
Are you moving to the rhythm of a Japanese instructor watching a swallow dive? Or the discipline of a Korean pioneer rebuilding an art after a world war? Or in that exact moment, does your body become a living interception of all four?
That was our look at the history of Wanshu. What I think makes this form so compelling is that its story reflects something larger about traditional martial arts as a whole. The forms we practice didn't appear in a vacuum. They were carried by people, shaped by different cultures, and preserved through teaching, repetition, and memory. Sometimes the historical record is clear, and sometimes it's not. Either way, there's value in taking the time to look carefully. For me, studying form history is not just about trying to strip the mystery out of martial arts. It's about gaining a deeper respect for the path these traditions took to reach us. When we understand that journey a little better, I think we practice with more gratitude, more humility, and a stronger sense of connection. Thanks for spending this time with me on Black Belt Radio. If you'd like to read the original white paper on Wanshu, it's available on our website at unitedtangsudo.com. I'm your host, Kevin Case. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.